educators. I am new to live streaming on Substack. My goal, though, is to do something that I really like a lot, which is facilitating conversations with people, particularly people who are experts in their fields. And so right now, I'm actively seeking DEI experts, people who are consultants, educators, whether you're a professor or former professor of DEI or it's your lived experience and you're out in the world doing that work. I'd like to feature experts of all types in DEI to come on the weekly Revel Roundup. Why did I name it that? Revel Roundup, so that we can talk about the importance of why these things being under attack are problematic is a pretty common topic, but where do we move from here? How do we continue to educate people who want to learn? Because there are a lot of people who once you know better, want to do better. And the Rebel Educator Alliance is really the platform for us to continue educating, collectively, collaboratively educating and spreading the word about the people who are out here doing the work, and really connecting audiences with the people who are teaching this content because it's being stripped away in every educational setting. And I want to help amplify the voices of people who are doing that work. So, if you don't know me, my name is Amy Weisner. I have a PhD in communication. My background is in marketing and relationship development and all of the aspects of maintaining relationships for business. And then I did my master's and PhD in communication. I've taught in several business schools. I've taught business communication, and I most recently was fired for teaching DEI content in my classroom. I had 600 business students every semester, and um, I mean, it was pre baseline, basic diversity, equity, inclusion types of content. And I was attacked for that. And then, of course, they went on the full Fox News media tour, and it's been quite an interesting few years. But at this point, I realize, I want to be able to bring what I know about marketing and communication and selling and all of the aspects of business that often feel really, really uncomfortable for educators in particular, and helping people who teach this kind of content to take that to the free market. So to translate, the content that I have is called From Syllabus to Sales Page. And that's taking your sales or excuse me, taking your syllabus information, which is really structured around people who are a captive audience, people who are told that they have to take your class for one reason or another. In an academic setting, you don't have to think about what is the transformation that I'm promising, what would make somebody want to take this class most of the time. Sometimes people have to market their classes, but most of the time, your content um, is part of a curriculum that is um, required for people to get their degree. And so when that is the case, we approach it differently. We have learning objectives that are based on testing so that we have, all of the academic metrics in place, but we don't um, necessarily think about this in terms of, selling a product. And so when you take that content, if you are an educator and you want to take that content to the free market, you have to think about it differently. People don't just say, "Ooh, I want to learn about, theories of conflict." That's not a transformation. That's interesting. But people want to know, how do I deal with um, a very, overly aggressive conflict avoidant or, conflict, whatever. I don't know. I'm coming up with this on the fly, off the cuff. But how do we learn? How do we take that into a transformation? I want to have better conflict management skills so that I, as maybe a shy introverted person, can advocate for myself with a really aggressive coworker or something like that, right? I'm not really an introvert. saying as an example. So thinking about how do we transform people's lives, what I hear a lot, and so this will be like our little free, lesson for the day is, what I hear a lot is, especially with people who are in liberation work, is very abstract language. Like people work with me and they gain liberation from systems of oppression, or they acknowledge and learn about the oppression they've been complicit in. Um, those are not the kinds of things that people are seeking. Those are not buying triggers, right? And so, if we're going to survive capitalism and we want to continue educating people and still continue, feeding our families and ourselves, we have to use capitalism's tools to spread the message. And so, the first thing we have to think about is, really, um, what is that transformation? What am I doing? What I'm offering is not only a platform for people to come and talk about the work that they're doing, but also on the inside, for subscribers, I'm working with people on how to transform educational content into a sellable, attractive product that people will give you money for, reliably. And part of doing that is figuring out who am I even talking to. And this is something I have this conversation with nearly every single client that I work with. Does not matter how big or small, does not matter what they're working toward. This is the conversation that I have so often. So let me clear it up. When I'm thinking about marketing and communication, the most important aspect of that is knowing who you're speaking to. You cannot tailor a message if you do not know who you're speaking to. Now, I've often told my students that the easiest target audience is yourself. So if you're providing transformation work that is something that you also have been through, that's going to be the easiest to think about because you can think about previous versions of yourself and think, what would I have thought about this? What would my objections have been? Why might I have resisted giving money to this? Why, because then you can start to speak specifically to that individual's needs. So the easiest is if you are speaking to somebody who is some version of yourself. Now, what I have found is in a lot of cases, if we are centering the voices of the most marginalized people doing work in the liberation world, we're talking about people who are often Black women who have maybe a target audience of other Black women, but specifically those who are, God bless them, working with white women or white people, or even doing work in corporate America, that you are often talking to an audience that you know a lot about because in your world, you are always aware of how we operate, but what you might not be aware of is what's really happening in our minds, right? And so I think one of the really important elements is if you have a target audience that isn't you, you as a as an example, as a Black woman have never been a white woman, right? You observe us and you know a lot more about us than we know about ourselves. I can attest to that. Um, but having the voice of white women responding to the content that you're creating and what you're marketing is going to be essential. So you have to think about who are your stakeholders. And so when we think about who is the ideal client, it cannot just be, in this case, all white women. It can't be, because that's too broad. You have to speak specifically to an individual. And oftentimes in marketing, we talk about this as, your whether it's your ideal client or your avatar, your customer avatar, and like giving that person a name and very specific demographics, very specific information that helps you identify where they might live, literally geographically, but also like where do they live in online spaces? Where do they go to ask the questions about the things, the problems that you solve? And so we often also talk about what problem are you solving for those people? But to me, that's like a down the road conversation. First and foremost, we have to figure out who are you talking to? Who do you want to be working with? When you think about the work that you've done, who do you enjoy working with the most? Um, and so, like for me, one of the things that I think is sort of a blessing, took me a while to get to thinking about being fired from my professor job as a blessing, but something that is a blessing is that I was spending all of my energy trying to beg undergrads to understand the importance of communication as connection, and building connections not for a transactional purpose, but for the purpose of being a human and humaning well, and learning how to sit with difference, being able to communicate across differences, and really being open and curious to hearing other people's perspectives. And obviously, in a highly polarized world, that's pretty pretty challenging. It got much more challenging as time went on. Um, but now I get to work with people who are value aligned with me. So this week I met with this just incredible consultant who works specifically at the intersection of engineering and inclusivity. So thinking about how we engineer a world for the purpose of being as inclusive as possible. And so one of the conversations that we had was, you know, this fits in a lot of places, but who have you worked with that you've enjoyed the most? And as we started talking about it, this really clear customer started to come to mind. And it was kind of an amalgamation of different kinds of customers. And so you're thinking about, what are the aspects of the ideal client? For me, it's somebody who's open to feedback and is growth minded, because often the willingness to be vulnerable and see your own weaknesses in the way that you're talking about this thing that's very near and dear to you, right? So if you're an educator, and your content is something that you are an expert in, it's hard to hear when you're not communicating about that well. And so for me, having people who can sit with that and be open to hearing how subtle shifts often are enough to move the needle. And so that's for me somebody who I want to work with. Also, somebody who doesn't require handholding. That was one of the aspects of teaching undergrads was constantly holding their hand and like dangling the carrot of a grade in front of them. And so I want, for me, an ideal client is working with people who um, they go off and they continue working on their homework because they want to, not because there's a grade at the end, and who aren't only exclusively motivated by money. People who are motivated to make a difference in the world are my people. But then, finding that lane of how do I help people while also charging an appropriate amount of money so that I can survive capitalism. And so when I start thinking about, who are the people who have fit into that, those descriptors, who are they? Who have I worked with? What are some of the challenges that I've seen? Because that can sometimes help me think about who I don't want to work with, right? I don't want to work with somebody who is constantly combative, right? That it's can't ever see another perspective. That is not worth either of them. Yeah, it's not worth my time and it's not worth yours. Um, but people who maybe can't see outside of what they've already created also, because sometimes if you've spent so much time working on your own content for a really long time, then you feel like really connected with it, and hearing feedback that's possibly perceived as negative, though intended to be helpful, um, is challenging. And so having people who can sit with that difficulty, that challenge, when we're assessing their baby is important. Um, and so when I start thinking about, who are the people who have fit into those categories for me, I can start describing a specific customer type. Some of my favorite people I've worked with are people who have left academia either because they were fed up with the institutional bullshit, or people who have been fired, targeted, like I was, because we all get it. We're teaching something that we're incredibly passionate about, that we believe in our heart and in our souls, in our hearts and our souls, will make a difference in the world for humanity. And it's not about telling people what they should believe, but teaching people how to think. And so those are the kinds of people that, for me, that I really enjoy working with. And so then I can start to define, does that mean that I'm only going to work with professors who've been fired or who've left the academy? Of course not. I work with all sorts of different kinds of people, people who are fresh out of their PhD program and want to do consulting so that they can, pay back their student loans while they're also finding their dream professor job. I mean, there are all sorts of different people I've worked with. Um, but for me, that, sort of sweet spot is somebody who's just getting ready to transition into the space of teaching in the free market. Um, I have worked with plenty of people who are already established. Um, but for me, I feel like I can help you the most before you've already set up a lot of, foundational groundwork because um, we might have to undo some of that together. And so, again, does that mean that I don't work with people who already are established? That's just, I think, not necessarily the sweet spot for me. The sweet spot for me is somebody who's like, it is time for me to start teaching outside of the institution. How do I do this? How do I take my syllabus and turn it into a sales page? And then what do we do from there? Those are my ideal clients. And so to be able to talk about that person and really develop, a clear understanding of who they are and what they, where they live and what they, what they need, I can start thinking about specific people that I know. Fortunately or unfortunately for me, I am one of those people. So I can think about how I felt when I first lost my job, when students filed a federal lawsuit, which by the way was dismissed because they had nothing. I didn't have any idea what to do. I was all alone with my two little kids. I was getting threatened and harassed and, getting death threats with my kids named in those messages to me. And I went off the grid. I went into literal hiding because I was so scared and I was so alone. I had no one to talk to. And that isolation is one of the most important aspects of why I am building community around this. This isn't about each individual person developing their content to then go off and do it on their own. It's about us all lifting one another up and creating a new way for people to learn this content because there are a lot of places where they will not have access to diversity, equity, inclusion, social and emotional learning, critical thinking, accurate history, real science. Those kinds of things are being defunded and discontinued, canceled, and people are losing their jobs. And so come over here. I do have a subscriber rate of $200 a year for founders. You get a free t-shirt with that, and you get an 8-week training with me, and you get weekly um, office hours, happy hours. We're calling them happy hours because it's really more about like bringing your work that you're working on to get your material ready for the free market and having the whole room of other educators, including me, there to give you feedback. And so it'll be less about like anyone teaching and more about us all giving feedback and hyping one another up. And so that's really what I'm creating. And I'm creating it because this is what I wish had existed. Had something like this existed when I was going through this 3 years ago, I think that my turnaround and my mental well-being would have been um, much more. My turnaround would have been faster, and my mental health would have been um, vastly improved. So that's what I'm doing here. If you are DEI expert, social emotional learning, anything in the crosshairs of the current administration, contact me, DM me, let me know that you're interested in coming on. I'd love to have a conversation and talk about why this content is important and why we need to encourage people to keep going outside of the institution. We cannot let them strip this away and then have generations of people without access to this material. And so that's what we're here for, is to make sure that it's readily available and affordable. Um, and I think there are some really incredible ways that we can offer that still helps the educators um, survive capitalism. So that's all I have for today. I'm looking forward to having guests on in the future. If there's anybody that you'd like to see, or if there's anything else that you'd like to know, um, let me know, and I'll see you next week. Okay, love you. Bye.